I've been thinking more about this relationship between certain aspects of the medieval and post-medieval mind, and how that kind of produces the God concept, particularly around the time of Newton and Descartes, and how particular understandings of God possibly necessarily emerge along with those ideas. And I'm entirely basing this on my sort of personal experience, really. As I sort of play with these ideas, I can feel a necessity for that kind of explanation welling up. I'm an atheist. So I'm just trying to wrestle with those ideas a little bit more. And what I'm thinking of right now is this idea of the God of the gaps, which was a huge problem. It still is a problem for some people, I guess. The God of the gaps is a problem for, it's not a problem for atheists. Atheists have no issue with that because we just don't believe in God, full stop. But it's also a problem for theologians and theists. Where the God of the gaps, as I understand it at least, comes from is that God is inherently unknowable, and conversely that which is unknowable and unknown is of God. And certainly history provides us with examples of phenomena that used to be considered emanations of God or something like that. And I'm thinking of sunlight, for example, or the space between the stars. And because of advancements in knowledge, those things are no longer considered unknown. So that which was unknown was divine. The problem with that is, well, yeah, so just to enhance that a little bit more. So what that model sets up is this idea that some things are known, but there's a vast amount of stuff that's not known and is inherently unknowable. And the reason why it's unknown and unknowable is because it's God. So all the unknown stuff is God. It's called the God of the gaps because it posits God as kind of existing in this plenum between these little islands of knowledge, space between the stars, as I said. A difficulty with that theologians and theists have is that inevitably, as knowledge increases, as we gain more knowledge, the amount of space there is between those islands of knowledge decreases. And that's been exponential, of course, over the last 400 years. So what we see there is a model of a deity that is getting smaller over time. And most people who have a theological bent would have a problem with that. Certainly if I believed in God, I would not like it if God was in the process of leaving the building piece at a time. So the gap, the God of the gaps, is problematic for those reasons. But I think one of those interesting things that comes up about that is where it comes from. And I think where it comes from is firstly the intuitive spatialization of knowledge that we have. This is something I've spoken about a lot, and it appears again here. When we talk about gaps in knowledge, whether we fill those gaps with knowledge with God or not, when we talk about gaps in knowledge, we're spatializing knowledge. We're seeing knowledge as kind of islands in a sort of sea of emptiness, or as objects on a plane of emptiness, as marks on an empty page, that kind of thing. There are large gaps between different elements, different objects of knowledge, different known facts. And so the idea of gaps in knowledge is ultimately spatial. If we are theistically minded and we're looking for God, we have two choices once we've got that model of spatialized knowledge. We can either place God in the gaps, in the plenum, in the unknown, which produces the God of the gaps problem, or we can not, in which case, if we buy into the spatial model at all, we have to say that God isn't just in the gaps, it's also in the stuff. So God is in this tree, and God is in my dog, and God is in this field. That presents a completely different problem for theists, which is to do with, well, it's an act of pantheism, which some people don't have a problem with, some religious practices don't have a problem with, and certainly religious naturalists like Ursula Goodenough, for example, wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that idea, that God is not an anthropomorphic guy in a beard, nor is he the giant sphere of Xenophanes. He is he, she, it, they are immanent and supervenient upon or coexistent with or coterminous with, or just are that which is. Okay, so God of the gaps, and the God that's not of the gaps comes out of a different idea of there being gaps full stop. So the God of the gaps emerges out of the gap of the gods.